New Falcons linebacker Kaden Ellis's path to double-digit sacks is shorter than you think.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, everyone, you are Locked On Falcons. And of course, you know me, the host of this illustrious podcast, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black. And of course, I want to thank everyone who is a everydayer that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. And of course, follow in their footsteps by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we will be talking quite a bit about Kaden Elliss as well as the Falcons pass rush as a whole. And then later in the episode, we will be joined by Jimmy Stein, one of the co-hosts of the Locked On Bama podcast, to talk about the Falcons' 7th round safety in DeMarcco Hellams. But as I am sort of, knee deep in Zach Harrison film as we gear up for my, film breakdown, scouting report, whatever you want to call it, probably later this week. I'm thinking quite a bit about the Falcons pass rush, and maybe we'll turn this into a series, but thinking about some of the various players that could, be the leaders in terms of sack production for the Falcons this year. And, one of those players that I think is a legit candidate is Kaden Elliss. And we mentioned Kaden Elliss last week on the podcast, talking where a listener asked a question about, the Falcons linebacker core. And I talked about how Kaden Elliss, it wouldn't shock me if Kaden Elliss wound up leading the team in sacks this year. And so, I want to start off talking about kind of the floor and the ceiling, speaking of scouting reports, on what Kaden Ellis's sack potential and production potential could be this upcoming season. And part of the way that we can make these projections is looking back at what Demario Davis did in New Orleans, where we saw this past year, especially Kaden Elliss kind of take over Demario Davis's role as that primary pass rusher for the Saints from that linebacker position. And it's notable. And I think that's a testament to how good Kaden Elliss was, that when you look at Demario Davis, who's been one of the best pass rushing linebackers in the league for the 4 previous seasons, where he had 542 combined pass rushing snaps across 64 games, about 8.5 per game. And that consistently ranked in the top 5 in terms of off-ball linebackers in terms of pass rushing snaps. And you saw the season that he had in 2019, where he had the most times getting those opportunities, which is 168 snaps, or about 10.5 per game. And so you can take that 10.5 per game and think of it as kind of the high range in terms of what we could see from Kaden Elliss this year. And so across 17 games, about 10.5 would be about 180 pass rushing snaps. And that roughly corresponds with what Kaden Elliss did in the back half of the season, where we saw him get 80 snaps over the last 8 games in terms of rushing the quarterback this past year. And then you look at the low end in terms of how many opportunities Kaden Elliss could get this year. Before this past year, Davis's lowest total was about 112 pass rushing snaps, which is about 7 per game. This past year, he only averaged about 4 pass rush snaps per game. But I assume that Kaden Elliss will get more than 4 rushing opportunities each and every week, just because part of the selling point that the Falcons had to Kaden Elliss as they signed him in free agency was that he would be given, maybe not, I don't know if they said equal opportunity, but it was heavily implied that he'll be able to get to rush the quarterback quite as often as he did a year ago. So again, low end opportunities for Kaden Elliss this upcoming season. If he averages 7 pass rushing snaps a game, that's about 119 across 17 games. So let's give it 120 for a nice even round number. So at the very least, we're talking about Kaden Elliss getting 120 pass rushing snaps this year, up to potentially 180. And so now the question is, what will Kaden Elliss do with those opportunities? And that's where pressure rate comes into play. And we've talked a bit on this podcast. I'm sure you guys have heard elsewhere, the difference between pressures and sacks is pressures tend to be a little bit more consistent year to year in terms of an individual player's production versus sacks. And you look at Kaden Ellis's pressure rate in 2022, this past year, he had 19.4% pressure rate. And over the final 8 games where he got the bulk of those opportunities, about 20.5% pressure rate. Now his career pressure rate with the Saints was 18% due to his pressure rate being 13.9% the previous year as a part-time player. And you compare that with Demario Davis's pressure rate across his career with the Saints, it was 18.8%. His best year, was this past year, despite the limited opportunities, where his pressure rate was 26.1%. The year where he had the most pressures was 2020, where he had 33 pressures that year. His pressure rate that year was 24.3%. So, I think we can use 14% from Kaden Ellis's 2021 season as the low end pressure rate for Kaden Elliss moving forward. In the high end, let's say 25%, which would be comparable to the peak of Demario Davis. So when we look at our parameters, our lowest end is Kaden Elliss gets 14% pressure rate on 120 snaps. That means he'll finish this upcoming season with about 17 pressures. At the high end, Kaden Elliss, if he gets 25% pressure rate on 180 snaps, that means he could get up to 45 pressures, right? That's a really high number. So if we're just splitting it evenly, we'll say about 30 pressures if we're talking eye level stuff, guys, here on the podcast. So about 30 pressures seems to be a realistic expectation for Kaden Elliss based off of the low end and the high end. And so now we got to look at, in terms of sack production, we got to look at the sack conversion rate, which is basically how many sacks does a guy get every time he gets pressure on the quarterback. And I'll skip the math. Basically, the low end sack conversion rate is about 20%, which is based off of Demario Davis's career average. And the high end would be about 35%, which is based off of Davis's career high, as well as Kaden Ellis's career high this past year in terms of sack conversion rate. So our floor for Kaden Elliss, when we put all these numbers together, we put our low end snaps, our low end pressure rate, and our low end sack conversion rate. That's about 3.5 sacks for Kaden Elliss this upcoming season. But our ceiling for Kaden Elliss is an extraordinary 16 sacks if he gets the high end snaps, if he gets the high end pressure rate, and he gets the high end sack conversion rate. And if you just split the difference and go eye level, right, that's about 9.5 to 10 sacks right there. So clearly there is a path for Kaden Elliss to be a double digit sack guy. Now, if you just split the difference between all of the things in terms of snaps, in terms of pressure rate, that would be 150 snaps, 19.5% pressure rate, and about 27.5% sack conversion rate. That would equal roughly about 8 sacks. So in a lot of ways, I think an average year for Kaden Elliss is realistic based off of his previous body of work, as well as that of Demario Davis. And I'm sure, people will counter, well, you can't expect Kaden Elliss to be as good as Demario Davis. Although, again, going back to the earlier point I made, which is based off of the fact that the Saints thought Kaden Elliss was a better option than Demario Davis in the latter half of the season, kind of tells you that I don't think that, to dismiss Kaden Elliss, to say that he can't outproduce Demario Davis, I don't think would be fair to Kaden Elliss or the New Orleans Saints brass. But again, I think it's very likely that an average year for Kaden Elliss is an 8-sack sort of season, and therefore the jump from him to get from 8 sacks to 10 sacks or more sacks is not as massive a leap as I think probably a lot of people assume. And I think one of the ways that Kaden Elliss can be successful to maximize those opportunities is by utilizing the stunts that were so often frequently used by the Saints over the last couple of years. And the expectation is that we'll see Ryan Nielsen, the Falcons' new defensive coordinator, port that over from New Orleans. But I think one of the questions is going to be, do the Falcons have that sort of alpha pass rusher, right? And whether that's going to hold back this unit. And I don't think it necessarily is, because I think in part due to the Falcons utilizing stunts to basically offset the fact that they don't have that alpha will lead to them having greater sack production and greater pressure production this year than they have in recent years. And we'll talk about that and break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you about the great folks at Built Bar who offer us the, from like manna from heaven, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, because Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. They're low in sugar, they're low in calories, but they have a whopping 17 grams of protein. They come in a variety of flavors. I myself just ordered a box that should be arriving in the next day or two, probably by the time you guys are listening to this. So the next time you hear me talk about Built Bars, I'll be telling you my review on the Red Velvet Puff bar, as well as some other flavors. But you guys can order yourself a limited time flavor like the Red Velvet Puff or other limited time flavors by going to built.com. Use the promo code LOCKEDON15, just like I did, and you'll get 15% off. And you can also check out Built Bars at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. Just head to the pharmacy section in the Walmart, grab yourself a 4-bar box of the cookies and cream or double chocolate. You can run into Sam's and get a 13-bar box of brownie batter puff or churro. So check out Built Bar. You will thank me later. So, continuing today's episode, talking a bit more about the Falcons pass rush as a whole. And, I think that's been one of the frequent criticisms that some have had about the Falcons offseason, which is they didn't go out there and get themselves an alpha. I don't know if that's a real fair criticism of the Falcons offseason, but it's understandable. That is probably the most glaring issue, and particularly when it comes to an edge rusher. We're hoping we'll see a big leap for Arnold Ebiketie. Maybe that will be a topic later this week on the podcast. Certainly at some point this summer we will take a deeper look into Arnold Ebiketie and the expectations for him this upcoming season. But it goes back to a conversation we had with Damian Parson of the Locked On NFL Draft podcast when we were talking about his thoughts on the Zach Harrison selection, and talking about how Zach Harrison isn't necessarily that guy that, to use a basketball analogy, that can go out there and create his own shot or get you a bucket when you need it, right? The equivalent in football is like, it's 3rd and 7, it's the 4th quarter, you need someone to go out there and get you a sack, get you a pressure, and Zach Harrison may be that guy, and the Falcons may not necessarily have that guy again, although we're hoping Grady Jarrett can be that guy, as well as Arnold Ebiketie. But to use a baseball analogy, it's having that ace pitcher, having that closer is what we're talking about when the Falcons don't have an alpha. And again, I don't know if it's a fair criticism of the Falcons offseason, because there really weren't any of those guys, especially at the edge rusher position, available in free agency. And I don't really know if there were that many guys available in the draft, right? Will Anderson and Tyree Wilson were the two guys that most people projected that had the most potential to be that sort of alpha player. And then after that, the jury was still out on Lucas Van Ness and Miles Murphy and Nolan Smith. And I certainly was very skeptical of several of those guys developing into that alpha type of player. So I don't know if that's a fair criticism of the Falcons offseason, but obviously I think that will be something that the Falcons will continue to work towards, but I don't necessarily know that that's always an automatic reason for success, because you look at a team like the Raiders, who have, just like the Falcons, been one of the league's worst pass rushers these last several years, and they've had alphas. They've had Khalil Mack back in 2017. They've had Max Crosby the last couple of years, and even though their pass rush has been better the last couple of years than the Falcons, overall, they're still like the 2nd worst pass rush in the NFL, despite having an alpha. So I don't think just having an alpha automatically means success. It's more about the overall quality. But when you don't have that guy, I do think it does put pressure on your defense and your scheme and your play caller, the defensive coordinator, to try to manufacture ways to enhance pressure that, having that one guy that can go out there and get you a bucket, so to speak, may not exist for your team. And I think the way that the Falcons will do that is by utilizing stunts. That was something that the Saints did quite a bit of. I expect that to, continue. That be one of the things that Ryan Nielsen ports over from New Orleans. And I read a study recently about that Pro Football Focus did right after the 2021 season, looking at the effectiveness of stunts, and they had basically shown that stunts lead to more pressure and more sacks than non-stunts do, although what was a notable thing about that study that they did right at the end of the 2021 season was, going back over the 5 previous years, the usage of stunts in the NFL had declined over that period of time, and they didn't necessarily offer a concrete conclusion as to why that was. And I certainly wouldn't have any greater insight than PFF would on that front. But for those of you that are not as familiar with stunts, I know probably the majority of you know what I'm referring to, but stunts, the classic stunt is when you have 2 defenders that are like twisting, right? Let me get the visual reference here in front of your camera, but you have an inside guy and an outside guy, right? The classic TE stunt, you got the defensive tackle on the inside, the edge rusher, the in on the outside, and you have one guy crash. So usually, you have the tackle crash into the offensive tackle that's supposed to block the edge rusher, and the edge rusher will loop inside, or you can have the edge rusher crash into the guard, and then have the tackle loop outside. That's your classic sort of stunt. So, I think we'll see quite a bit of that. Again, Kaden Elliss, that's all over Kaden Ellis's film. If you go back and watch the Saints, that was not something that the Falcons did a lot of under Dean Pease. We made note of that a year ago. And I think that's a contributing factor to why Grady Jarrett's production has fallen off the last 2 years under Dean Pease, because that was something that the Falcons did quite a bit under Raheem Morris. We've talked in the past about how, the differences between Raheem Morris as a play caller and Dean Pease as a play caller. Raheem Morris being a lot more aggressive, Dean Pease being a lot more conservative. I'm expecting Ryan Nielsen to be much more aggressive and bring back a lot of things that we were regular features of the Falcons defense from a schematic standpoint under, the Dan Quinn era, which is stunts, more man coverage, all those various things. And I think that will benefit the talent level of this team. But we didn't hold it against Dean Pease that he wasn't as aggressive. Now, certainly think it's fair to criticize maybe he could have dialed up a few more stunts than he did over the last 2 years. But we talked about the main difference between Raheem Morris and Dean Pease was Morris could afford to be more aggressive because of the Falcons offense in 2019 and 2020, where they had a lot more explosive potential. So if they fell into a hole, at least theoretically, they could much more easily climb out of that, although we can certainly argue whether or not they lived up to those expectations under Dirk Cutter. But with Matt Ryan, with Julio Jones, with Calvin Ridley, a 10-0 deficit wasn't some insurmountable lead, while the last couple of seasons, given the lack of weapons, given the lesser quarterback play, that seemed to be a much more problematic issue for the Falcons. We saw that in Desmond Ridder's first start against the Saints, where they basically fell into a 14-0 hole. They battled back, but pretty much any game where the Falcons fell into a 2-score deficit, they pretty much were guaranteed a loss the last couple of years, even if they did make it interesting in the fourth quarter. And the hope is that one of the things that will facilitate Ryan Nielsen being a lot more aggressive this season from a defensive play calling standpoint with some of these things, the blitzes and whatnot, is because the Falcons offense will be a lot more explosive, will be much more willing to be, we can be aggressive because a 10-0 lead is not some insurmountable lead due to, hopefully improved play from Desmond Ridder and the presence of Kyle Pitts and the growth of Drake London and Bijan Robinson, and of course, Scotty White, or for those of you that aren't familiar with some genius, he came up with this nickname for Scotty Miller called Scotty White. And so, we salute that genius person out there. But of course, that wasn't me because I'm so humble out here. But I do expect Nielsen to be a lot more aggressive in with his uses of blitzes and stunts. Now, we know the Saints weren't necessarily a team that blitzed a ton when it came to bringing 5 or 6 guys. So I don't think that's going to change. That's not something the Dean Pease did quite a lot of, but it was a lot of 4-man pressures on those simulated pressures, those sims and creepers that we talked about last summer. That Dean Pease was, he loved the creepers. And I think we'll see a lot more sims when it comes to Ryan Nielsen's defense, and we'll borrow Ted and Win of the Athletics definition that we discussed last summer that he wrote up in 2021. And he wrote, sims and creepers are both 4-man rushes that involve bringing 1 or 2 second or third level defenders while dropping 1 or 2 first level defenders. So an example would be blitzing an inside linebacker while dropping a defensive lineman. And he added further context that some people separate them as creepers or zones and sims or man. Creepers, we're not showing pressure. Sims, we are showing pressure. So you'll probably see a lot of instances where you'll see these 2 linebackers, and Troy Anderson and Kaden Elliss especially, mugging those A gaps, lining up in the A gaps. You'll have 6 defenders on the line of scrimmage with the 4 down linemen, the 2 linebackers, and it looks like from the offensive perspective that 6 guys could potentially come. They're bringing all out blitz, but only 4 of those guys, and it's up to the offense, the quarterback, the center, whoever, to figure out which 4 guys are coming, and that's a way that a defense can create pressure and scheme pressure in creative ways. And I'm expecting to see quite a bit of that, especially given the expectation that we'll see more man coverage, which lends itself to more of the sims than necessarily the creepers, which is zone coverage, a staple of the Dean Pease defense. I think that's going to see a lot of Kaden Elliss doing that. We'll see quite a bit of Troy Anderson. He was effective bringing that pressure from the second level last year, especially at the end of the season. And I also think the usage of stunts will accentuate a lot of players. We already mentioned Ellis. We already mentioned Grady Jarrett. Obviously, if you have Calais Campbell as that crash defender, that's that's definitely going to clear a runway for whoever that player that is looping inside or outside him. We obviously know David Onyemata coming from the Saints did his thing. I thought Lorenzo Carter did a good job with the Giants on stunts and whatnot. D'Angelo Malone has the speed and quickness to be able to shoot those gaps and be that loop defender. We know that the Steelers were very effective utilizing stunts and twists throughout, the height of Bud Dupree's time there. So he should benefit from that. The one player that I have kind of a question mark about benefiting from the stunts and twists is Arnold Ebiketie, because when you watch his Penn State film, he wasn't that effective doing that. And last summer I commented when I broke him down on my scouting report of him was that, well, because Dean Pease doesn't utilize a lot of those stunts and twists, it's not going to matter all that much. But that was something that stood out to me watching his film. So that would be something to keep an eye on. Does Arnold Ebiketie benefit from, the increased stunts and twists to the degree that some of these other players may be? But I think all in all, it's going to lead to increase in pressure and sacks for this team. I think overall, the Falcons pass rush is probably going to be better than probably some people think it's going to be, despite not having that alpha pass rusher. And it's all, going back to the statement, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, because the scheme is enhancing some of these players with the usage of the stunts and the twists and all these various things. And I think Kaden Elliss is a great option to be a direct beneficiary of this. And certainly the low end is maybe he gets 4 sacks this year, but I think the high end, is potential that he gets 8, 10, or more sacks this year. And I think I like that potential for the Falcons, for Kaden Elliss to maybe be on the stat sheet to look like the alpha, even if he isn't the main guy that's out there rushing each and every snap from a sack production. And while I think the Falcons, continue the basketball analogy alluded to before, the Falcons don't necessarily have that guy that can create his own shot off the dribble, but they're going to utilize with the stunts. It's going to be a lot of pick and rolls, and it's going to be an effective offense. And I think that's going to be a sign of the good coaching that the Falcons will have. But this is a conversation that we'll probably continue to unpack across the summer as we get geared up for the season, and certainly something that we'll keep an eye on as we talk about more guys. Obviously, later this week, we'll probably talk about Zach Harrison specifically. Where does he fit in on the stunts and twists? You'll have to check that out a little bit later, but continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. But we will wrap up today's episode by talking with Jimmy Stein of the Locked On Bama podcast, all about DeMarcco Hellams, the Falcons' 7th round safety. So we'll get into that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. All right, everyone, we are back with another illustrious guest here on the Locked On Falcons podcast, and he is none other than Jimmy Stein, the co-host of the Locked On Bama podcast. And of course, we're talking about the Falcons 2023 draft class, and of course, the Falcons nabbed an Alabama safety in DeMarcco Hellams in round 7. And Jimmy's, of course, here to talk with us about that. Jimmy, my friend, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. There's a lot of Alabama fans that support the Falcons due to proximity, so we'll get some Alabama fans listening as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So DeMarcco Hellams was a 2-year starter at Alabama, productive player, led the team in interceptions as a junior, but it seemed like he was kind of always overshadowed by guys like Jordan Battle and Brian Branch, at least from my perspective, obviously coming from the NFL and looking at those players as, prospective NFL prospects. I'm just curious to pick your brain on what did you think of DeMarcco Hellams' career at Alabama and sort of where he fit in the mix there on that defensive secondary.
Yeah, it's easy to get sort of in the shadows of other kids at Nick Saban's Alabama with kind of recruiting, the level of recruiting that Nick Saban produces annually. As soon as you get up to the top of the depth chart, they sign some other kid who's going to be a 3-and-done first-round pick. But DeMarcco Hellams managed to become a starter fairly early in his career. He actually, before he was a full-time starter, he was the starter in dime, I think as a sophomore, where in the dime package he would come in and play with the first team as a young player. And that's when Alabama fans first saw DeMarcco play regularly. And then in his final 2 years, he was a full-time starter at safety and all the packages, base, nickel, and dime, and never left the field. He's an interesting player, very instinctive. I would say what he brings to the table, Aaron, and probably the reason that the Falcons like DeMarcco the most is he's a very good tackler. He's a not a huge hitter so much as just a very fundamentally sound, doesn't miss tackles. When he hits you, he gets you to the ground. You're not going to see a lot of misses from him, and he's physical enough for sure. If he has issues, it's a little bit in coverage, and we'll talk about that. I would say that at Alabama, he was really Alabama's best box safety. A guy kind of plays a little lower, a guy that gets really involved in the run game, a guy that covers tight ends a lot, in coverage. And if he has some issues, it's in deep center field or when he somehow is matched up with an outside receiver one-on-one. That's what kept DeMarcco out of, let's say, Friday and into Saturday as it relates to the draft.
Yeah, you talk about him being probably Alabama's best box safety. Even though he's not the biggest guy in the world, he does sort of fit, at least from the handful of games I've watched of him, that sort of classic strong safety type of role you talked about, being comfortable against the run, being able to cover tight ends. That Tennessee game where he got kind of matched up deep against Jalen Hyatt a couple of times, and you saw some of those issues that you're talking about in coverage being exposed. I'm curious, what did you think of sort of, does he just kind of project, as you say, as that more classic strong safety, or do you feel like because of the experience that he has doing different things, as you mentioned, dime looks and whatnot in Alabama secondary, we know how well coached those defensive backs are, could he have a more expanded role in the NFL, do you think?
He certainly could. One thing is he's a very bright kid. This guy's bright. He picked up things quickly, and he'll pick up things quickly in the NFL. He has some leadership abilities too. I don't think he would ever be someone that would excel in some of the areas that were an issue for him at Alabama. Like, I don't think you'll see him in the NFL as a classic center fielder type. I just don't think there'll always be someone better. There'll always be someone better than him at that. There will always be a safety that's better at the man-to-man coverage with wide receivers. There'll always be someone better. Can he do it? Absolutely. Absolutely. He can get away with it. He's good enough, and for as much talk as there was about the Jalen Hyatt Tennessee game, Jalen Hyatt, for the Falcons fans that are unaware, Jalen Hyatt had 5 touchdown receptions against Alabama in their loss to Tennessee, caught 5 touchdown passes. They were all on big plays and vertical plays. And Hellams was apparently victimized 2 or 3 of those times. And Alabama fans, remember that. But as you know, Aaron, when a defensive back makes an error, makes a mistake, everyone can see it. When a front 7 guy makes a mistake, sometimes the fans never even know. But when someone on the back end makes an error, everybody sees it. I think Alabama had some missed assignment issues, and I don't think the way Alabama drew it up on those plays, that Hellams was supposed to be covering Tennessee's outside wide receiver that runs a 4.3 40. I don't think that was how Alabama drew it up, but there might have been some missed assignments, and then Hellams is the one closest to the play, so the fans blame him. Now, anytime an Alabama fan would get sort of critical of Hellams over that particular game, I bring up, he's been playing with the first team for 3 years. What's his second worst game? And no one has an answer for that. That was definitely a one-off for Hellams. And again, I don't think it was all necessarily on him for the most part. And when I say for the most part, every other game DeMarcco Hellams played for Alabama, he brought a lot more to the table. Excellent tackler, big play guy, and like you said, led the team in interceptions in his junior year. So he's not just a box guy, but it is what he does best. He will also be an outstanding special teams player because he can really run, and he's not shy about hitting you when he gets there.
Well, Jimmy, I apologize for bringing up some bad memories from that Tennessee game here on the podcast. But yeah, I agree with you generally. Like it felt like he was kind of victimized a little bit in that game by chance, not necessarily because of skill and whatnot. But let's talk a little bit more positive about some Alabama safeties, and let's compare DeMarcco Hellams to some of the guys. Obviously, you have players like Minkah Fitzpatrick and Xavier McKinney and Eddie Jackson that were drafted highly, went on to be effective starters in the league. But I'm just curious, where do you sort of stack DeMarcco Hellams, in this recent history of Alabama safeties with guys like Deontay Thompson and some of these other players that have gone on to have some success in the NFL? Where do you sort of see DeMarcco Hellams?
Yeah, I think Deontay Thompson, I like that. There was a player that's been retired for a while from the NFL that had quite a bit of success in the NFL, primarily with the Cardinals, Rashad Johnson. He's a lot like DeMarcco Hellams. I think that's a really good comp for him. At Alabama, there's a handful of superstar players all the time, and Minkah Fitzpatrick is a great example of that, who is a superstar at Alabama day one and has continued to be a superstar in the NFL with first the Dolphins and now the Steelers. I wouldn't put Hellams, to be honest, in that category. There's a reason Fitzpatrick was a first-team All-American at Alabama and then a first-round draft pick, and we're talking about Hellams being taken in the 7th round. But I think there's a level of player that I would just refer to as solid. DeMarcco Hellams was solid at Alabama. That he did have the hiccups against Tennessee. And then for a player who started really for more than 2 years, it's hard to name the other hiccups because there weren't really a lot of bad plays there. Just a solid player, not necessarily a huge playmaker, not a guy that was a candidate to be SEC Defensive Player of the Week, but just every time the coaches grade the film on Sundays after Saturday's game, you got the feeling that every Sunday DeMarcco had that was solid. He was never in danger of losing his job. Even after that Tennessee game, he's not only did he start the following week, not only was he out there, the very next week, he absolutely, he played extremely well. It wasn't just talk of, hey, you think DeMarcco go to the bench? He played one of his very best games. The next week against Mississippi State, I think he led the team with 12 or 13 tackles the following week against Mississippi State. There was never any real conversation about putting DeMarcco Hellams on the bench. And that's after playing 2.5 years and having good players behind him, players that you'll be talking about next year's draft, like Malachi Moore, who's going to be a drafted Alabama safety in the 2024 draft. And we have a freshman showing up this fall, a guy from Georgia, from the Atlanta area, Caleb Downs, whose older brother was just drafted in the 3rd round as a wide receiver. Caleb Downs showed up basically as an immediate starter at safety. He could end up being a Minkah Fitzpatrick level type player. That's the kind of talent Alabama has always had under Nick Saban. And it's a tribute to DeMarcco Hellams that he was able to start for more than 2 years with the amount of talent that's always coming in and out of Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like that Alabama pedigree, especially over the last decade or more, especially with the DBs, you do, as you mentioned, you have these Minkah Fitzpatricks that go on to be NFL stars, but then you have like the next tier of guys that just wind up, like Clinton Dix and Eddie Jackson that go on to be, starters for like 7 years in the NFL. And then even guys that stick around as reserves, for like 5 to 7 years. It is a NFL pipeline. And I do think from what I have seen from DeMarcco Hellams and having this conversation with you, Jimmy, today, it does feel like he's going to be one of those players that winds up, he'll find a role in the NFL, whether that's a special teams player, whether that's a backup or, potentially even a starter down the road. So I really appreciate you coming in on today's episode and sharing your insight into DeMarcco Hellams. Any last thoughts on Hellams and where can people find your, stuff online and what you guys got coming up on Locked On Bama?
Sure. Locked On Bama. Of course, we're here 5-6 times a week. And with any breaking news, we talk about the NFL quite a bit. We are Locked On Bama, but this week the NFL schedule release got us really interested. There's now over 70 Alabama players in the NFL. And whenever we have the schedule release, that we do whole episodes on, hey, when the Dolphins play the Panthers, it's Tua versus Bryce, and so we do get a lot of NFL talk, and there are a lot of Falcons fans. The last thing I'd say about DeMarcco Hellams is this: had Hellams been taken in like the 3rd round or the 4th round, I've seen enough of him to where being objective as like a 3rd round pick, I'd go, that's a bit of a stretch. I'm not 100% sure he will be an every down starter in the NFL. But I can say this: as a 7th round pick, he's a steal, because he will be one of the best safeties in the room at what he does best. So I think you're exactly right, Aaron, and DeMarcco finding a role that can help the team. And boy, if you find a solid role player and a good special teams player in the 7th round, that's a steal. And I think that's a great way to describe Hellams.
Absolutely. Well, Jimmy, I really appreciate you joining me on today's Locked On Falcons. Look forward to, I'm sure we'll be having some future chats, because I think the Falcons and so many other NFL teams always find a way to go back to that Alabama well at some point in the future. So look forward to our future conversations, Jimmy, but really appreciate you joining me on Locked On Falcons.
Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
All right, guys, that's going to do it. Thanks, Jimmy Stein, for joining us on today's episode. Later this week, possibly tomorrow, we should be talking with Locked On Gamecocks about Javon Gwynn. So you can look forward to that. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the plan is to do a Zach Harrison breakdown. I don't know what day it's going to be. It could be Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, one of these days. It just depends. I should be able to wrap up the film in the next, probably by the time you're listening to this, I'm wrapping up the film, and then it just takes, I got to let the ingredients marinate before I come out. Usually I like to at least let it marinate for a day before I do the breakdown. So we'll see how that goes, but that's in store for you later this week. We'll maybe talk more about some of this pass rush since we spent, so much of the last couple of weeks talking about the offense. So, give the defense some love on the podcast maybe this week. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Go check out Locked On Bama if you want to get more insight into, the Crimson Tide. Of course, Locked On NFL Draft, they're doing summer scouting, Locked On NFL Scouting with the draft dudes, also, mixing in summer scouting as well as, breaking down some of the various, things to expect from various teams this upcoming season. So it's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every